The rain drummed softly on the tiled roof of the official residence in Tokyo as Admiral Yamamoto laid the American report back on his desk and removed his glasses. For a long moment, he simply stared at the paper as if willing the figures to change. 8 new fleet and light aircraft carriers commissioned by the United States since the outbreak of war. By comparison, Japan, with all its sacrifices and all its boasts, had commissioned only 1 true fleet carrier in the same span. He stood up slowly and walked to the window, looking out over the dimly lit garden. The pines were silhouettes against the winter sky. Somewhere beyond the darkness lay the Pacific, and beyond that, the shipyards of California and Virginia that the report described in unnervingly precise detail. He tapped the paper with one thin finger and spoke in a flat voice to his aide. "This," he said, "is what it means to awaken a sleeping giant." If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The aide, Commander Tada, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. He had been with Yamamoto through the triumphant planning for Pearl Harbor, through the tense days of the Midway operation, and through the slow, grinding realization that the war in the Pacific was not unfolding as the Naval General Staff had promised. The Admiral's famous phrase about the giant had already spread through the fleet, half admiration, half warning. Now, confronted with the hard arithmetic of tonnage and industrial output, it sounded less like prophecy and more like an admission of defeat written in steel. Yamamoto picked up the report again. It was a composite, intelligence summaries, snippets from American newspapers and magazines, photographic reconnaissance of shipyards, and naval attaché estimates of displacement and completion dates. There, in neat columns, were names that had already begun to haunt Japanese planners: Essex, Yorktown, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Enterprise refitted, Saratoga still in action, and a growing list of light carriers converted from cruisers and merchant hulls. Not rumors, not wishful thinking from enemy propagandists, but hull numbers, launch dates, commissioning ceremonies, air group complements. "We counted on time," Yamamoto said at last. "We thought we would have 2 or 3 years of advantage. Instead, they are using every month as if it were a decade." Tada, trained in the etiquette of agreeing without presuming, did what aides always did in such moments. He asked a careful question. "Admiral, could the Americans be exaggerating? Their newspapers boast. Their politicians have reasons to overstate their achievements." Yamamoto shook his head. "No. Our own photographs confirm the number of hulls on the ways. Their public figures on shipbuilding match the steel and aluminum they are producing. When the numbers from different sources tell the same story, it is no longer boasting. It is reality." He did not say what both men knew, that Japanese estimates before the war had been comfortable. They had assumed that American Congress and industry would be slow, that isolationist sentiment would limit full mobilization, that the United States would be forced to concentrate on Europe first. The Bureau of Naval Construction had calculated that if Japan shattered the Pacific Fleet at the beginning of hostilities, it would take at least 3 to 4 years for America to replace its strength in carriers and battleships. That calculation had been wrong. Yamamoto returned to his chair and opened a small leather notebook, one of the several, in which he jotted down thoughts that were too candid to put in official memoranda. He wrote a single line. "We did not underestimate American courage. We underestimated their factories." He had spent years in the United States as a naval attaché, and later as a student of their petroleum and steel industries. He had watched the assembly lines in Detroit with close attention, had noted the traffic along the Mississippi and the endless trains snaking across the continent. He spoke fluent English and played poker with American officers well enough to win their money and their confidence. He knew, better than most of his colleagues, that behind the easy manners and political quarrels lay a formidable capacity for organization and mass production, and yet even he had not imagined they could move this quickly. The report in his hands detailed how American shipyards had adopted methods familiar from their automobile plants: standardized hull sections built in parallel, welded construction instead of laborious riveting, a national network of subcontractors turning out boilers, turbines, radar sets, and gun mounts to common specifications so that a carrier built on the Atlantic coast could receive machinery from the Great Lakes and electronics from New Jersey without weeks of bespoke fitting. The time from keel laying to commissioning for their new carriers was shrinking from years to well under 2. By contrast, Japanese yards still built ships in the older way, mixing some modern methods with the habits of craftsmen who had served their apprenticeships before the First World War. Their carriers were finely made with careful attention to details of compartment layout and machinery, but every change in design added months. Every shortage of high-grade steel or armor plate forced compromises that could not be concealed. The figures on the page were a quiet indictment. 8 new American carriers in the last period surveyed, 1 new Japanese fleet carrier, Taiho, with 2 more laid down, but delayed by shortages of steel and the pressures of building battleships and cruisers at the same time. In the same months, American yards had also produced a score of smaller escort carriers, simple ships that carried fewer aircraft but could be built and commissioned in astonishing numbers. "It is like trying to fight a foundry with a sword," Yamamoto murmured. Tada, standing by the desk, studied his commander's face. The admiral was not a man prone to emotional outbursts. He had opposed war with the United States before it began, warning the civilian leaders that Japan could run wild for perhaps 6 months to a year. But after that, there were no guarantees. Now, the clock he had described in those warnings was ticking in his ears. "Admiral," Tada said gently, "you wrote that the giant would awaken. You expected something like this." "I expected them to rouse themselves," Yamamoto answered. "I didn't expect them to start running before we had finished our first step." He turned to another section of the report, this one devoted not to finished ships, but to the infrastructure behind them. American steel mills in Pennsylvania and Ohio running at record capacity. Aluminum smelters in the Pacific Northwest powered by new dams whose generators dwarfed anything in Japan. Thousands of women and older men drawn into the workforce to replace those drafted, taught to weld hull plates and assemble turbines. All of it underpinned by a banking system and a government able to raise vast sums through war bonds and taxation. Japan, by comparison, was straining just to maintain existing output. Its steel industry depended on imports of ore and coking coal, vulnerable to blockade. Its machine tool base was limited. Its shipyards in Kure, Yokosuka, Nagasaki, and Kobe were working desperately to turn out destroyers, submarines, and repair damaged hulls, as well as build new carriers. Labor was short, fuel was short, high-grade alloying metals were short. The war that naval officers had planned around gun calibers and armor thicknesses was becoming a contest of blast furnaces and dry docks. From the corridor outside, the faint sounds of the Naval General Staff working late carried into the room. The creak of floorboards, the rattle of typewriters, the low murmur of voices. On the wall hung framed photographs of battleships completed in earlier, more confident years. Yamato and Musashi, gigantic symbols of a doctrine built around decisive gun duels between battle lines. Glorious ships, and in his more candid moments, the admiral wondered if they had already become expensive anachronisms. He looked back at the list of American carriers and sighed. "We built one giant battleship," he said. "They are building a new kind of fleet." Tada hesitated. "Do you mean their carrier groups, Admiral?" "Yes," Yamamoto replied. "Look at how they organize them. Several large carriers operating together, screened by destroyers and cruisers, with escort carriers feeding aircraft to distant bases and protecting convoys. Each carrier is not just a ship. It is a mobile airfield, a factory for sorties. With 8 or more of them added to their pre-war force, they can fight in 2 oceans at once. We are struggling to keep enough decks in the front line to contest one." The irony cut deeply. It had been Yamamoto himself, years earlier, who had argued most forcefully that naval aviation would decide the next war. He had studied exercises showing how aircraft could disable or sink battleships long before main batteries came into range. He had championed the development of longer-range torpedoes and dive bombers, and he had pushed for carriers to be the centerpiece of fleet maneuvers rather than afterthoughts. Yet, even as he argued for air power, the country he served had lacked the industrial base to match his vision. Japan could build excellent planes and formidable carriers in small numbers. The United States, once mobilized, could build them in masses that defied belief. Yamamoto leafed through the report's appendix, pausing over graphs that charted tonnage launched each quarter. The United States lines curved upward in a smooth, steep arc. Japan's figures rose modestly, then flattened under the pressure of limited shipyard capacity and competing demands from the Army, which wanted transport ships, and from the submarine service, which needed new hulls to contest American supply lines. "The more victories we demand from our pilots and sailors," he said quietly, "the more obvious this gap becomes." "What shall we tell the General Staff?" Tada asked. "Tell them the truth," Yamamoto replied. "Tell them that while we debate whether to commit this or that carrier to this or that operation, the Americans are building an entire second fleet behind their first, that every carrier we lose cannot be replaced in less than 2 years, while they are adding new decks to the Pacific every few months. That if we do not achieve a decisive victory soon, we will be reduced to defending islands with ships that cannot be in 2 places at once." He paused, then added, "And tell them that the enemy we thought of as a merchant nation has become a nation of shipbuilders." It was not a dramatic line, not the sort of phrase that would be immortalized in schoolbooks, but it was the core of his reaction. He did not curse, did not pound his fist on the desk. Instead, he did what he had always done as a professional officer. He translated emotion into an assessment of risk. The report included one more section that unsettled him even more than the bare count of carriers. It described American plans for future construction. More Essex-class fleet carriers, already on the stocks, additional light carriers, converted from cruiser hulls, and dozens of escort carriers for convoy and amphibious operations. The numbers suggested that 8 new carriers were not an endpoint, but a beginning. Japan, by contrast, was already stretching its resources to finish the few large carriers laid down before the war, while trying to improvise smaller light carriers from merchant ships and incomplete hulls. Those conversions would add flight decks, but their hangars and elevators could not match the capacity of purpose-built American carriers. Their machinery was slower, their protection thinner. Yamamoto closed the report and sat in silence. Outside, the rain deepened, drumming steadily like distant gunfire. He thought back to the first meeting at the Naval General Staff when he had argued against war with the United States. He had explained, with the same calm voice he used now, that Japan's Navy might score brilliant victories early on, but that if the war dragged into a contest of factories and finances, Japan would be outmatched. He had used analogies then. A swordsman cutting down an opponent in a single stroke versus a wrestler who could absorb blows and still stand. What he held now in his hands was not an analogy, but a concrete demonstration. 8 carriers to 1. The question that remained was what to do. "Admiral," Tada ventured, "if we concentrate our remaining carriers and strike before these new American ships are fully integrated into their fleets, could we still achieve a decisive battle?" Yamamoto looked up, the shadow of a familiar fire in his eyes. "That is exactly what we must try," he said, "but we must understand the nature of the odds. Every time we sortie, we are wagering irreplaceable decks against ships that, for the Americans, are merely part of a growing series. If we win, we buy time. If we lose, we shorten the war in their favor. And they can afford to lose what we cannot." He rose once more and walked to a wall map of the Pacific, tracing with his finger the line of outposts: Truk, Rabaul, the Marshalls, the Gilberts, the Solomons. Each island represented months of effort, convoys of supplies, and perilous sea lanes patrolled by too few Japanese destroyers and too many American submarines. "In the past," he said, half to Tada and half to himself, Victory at sea depended on gunnery and seamanship. Now it depends on factories on the other side of the ocean. Their carriers are not just ships, they are the visible edge of an industrial tide. For the first time that evening, he allowed himself a hint of bitterness. We forced them to build a navy that they had only imagined on paper. We gave them the political unity they needed to mobilize. And now we are surprised that they are doing exactly what their people are capable of when aroused. He returned to his desk and reopened the notebook. This time, he wrote more slowly, choosing each word. "When I studied in America," he wrote, "I saw a country of contradictions, wasteful and energetic, careless and ingenious. I warned that if they were forced to fight in earnest, they would bring all of that energy to bear. Today's report on their carriers confirms this. They are not simply replacing what we sank at Pearl Harbor. They are multiplying it." He paused, considered, then added a final line. "Our miscalculation was not in underestimating their bravery, but in underestimating the speed with which a democracy can turn its workshops into an armory." The ink glistened for a moment, then soaked into the paper. Outside, the war at sea continued. Convoys advancing across the Pacific under new escort carriers, shipyards on the American coasts, fitting radar sets to carrier masts, Japanese workers painting rising sun insignia on the decks of the few new carriers emerging from their own yards. No single sentence could capture all that complexity, but Yamamoto's reaction captured its essence, a professional sailor's grim respect for an adversary whose strength lay far beyond any one battle. He closed the notebook and looked once more at the intelligence summary. 8 carriers, while we complete one, he said softly. In numbers such as these, words lose their meaning. He handed the report back to Tada. "Make copies for the appropriate sections," he ordered, "and when they read these figures, remind them of this. We did not merely awaken a giant, we taught it to build fleets in its sleep." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The first time Rear Admiral Chuichi Nagumo saw aerial photographs of the American carrier concentrations around Guadalcanal, he reportedly studied them for a long while in silence. The images were grainy, taken from high altitude, but the silhouettes were unmistakable. Multiple large flight decks, an escorting ring of cruisers and destroyers, supply ships trailing astern. Not the scattered, fragile force the combined fleet had hoped to face after Midway, but something harder to quantify, a system. Intelligence officers in Tokyo had a phrase for it. They spoke of second-line carriers appearing where, on paper, only 1 or 2 American decks ought to have been present. A raid that had been expected to come from a single task group instead showed the characteristics of a layered, rotating force. Pilots shot down over the Solomons described being picked up not only by destroyers, but by small carriers whose very existence had not yet been entered into Japanese registers. In staff conferences, admirals traced neat arrows on maps showing how a well-timed blow might still cripple American strength in the South Pacific. On the sea, captains reported something different. They spoke of fighting waves of aircraft that did not seem to diminish, of American units that could be damaged or driven off, but never quite annihilated. Every month, new hull numbers appeared in decrypted radio traffic. The 8 carriers that had so unsettled Yamamoto's thoughts were not a fixed total, but the vanguard of a moving column. From his headquarters at Truk, Yamamoto read the same reports and weighed them against the intelligence summary, still fresh in his mind. He understood that the war had entered a phase that doctrine books had not anticipated. Japan had built its naval strategy on the idea of a single, decisive battle between roughly comparable fleets, a modern echo of Tsushima. The Americans, with their growing array of carriers, escort carriers, and land-based airfields, were quietly refusing to offer such a battle on Japanese terms. They did not seek a single crushing encounter. They sought to grind. American planners, looking at their own figures in Washington, saw the matter in another light. The The new carriers sliding down the ways were not mere replacements for Lexington and Yorktown, lost in the furious first year. They were the foundation of a new operational method, fast carrier task forces that could move thousands of miles in a matter of days, envelop isolated garrisons, and support amphibious landings with a density of air power that no land-based force could match. Essex and her sisters were larger and tougher than most pre-war carriers, with armored hangars and improved damage control. The light carriers, built on cruiser hulls, were smaller but fast enough to keep up with the big decks, carrying compact air groups that added depth to any strike or defensive screen. Behind them moved the slower escort carriers, born from converted merchant hulls, ferrying replacement aircraft and supporting convoys. Individually, each ship was just a floating strip of steel. Together, they formed something greater, a mobile web of airfields that could be shifted from one theater to another. It was this web that Yamamoto sensed uncomfortably when he traced the disposition of American forces across the map. The 8 carriers accounted for in his report were not fixed assets tied to particular waters. They were nodes that could be reassigned with increasing ease as American logistics matured. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Within the Japanese Navy Ministry, some officers clung to the hope that superior crew quality and tactical finesse could still redress the balance. They pointed to the record of early war engagements, to the skill of Japanese torpedo squadrons, to the daring of night surface attacks. Air groups, fresh from training schools, still learned the names of Midway and Coral Sea as proof that a bold carrier strike could topple even a powerful opponent. But the officers, most intimately involved with operations, felt a different pressure. They saw the wear on their pilots, the cumulative damage to their ships, the thinning reserves of aviation fuel. Every sortie a Japanese carrier air group flew over the Solomons cost irreplaceable experience. Every American carrier damaged but brought safely back to Pearl Harbor or the West Coast returned months later with improved radar, thicker anti-aircraft batteries, and a fresh air group drawn from a training program that by now dwarfed Japan's. The intelligence report that Yamamoto studied had included a short, sober annex on pilot training on both sides. By the middle of 1942, American naval aviators were graduating from flight schools with hundreds of hours in modern aircraft, backed by a standardized curriculum and a growing cadre of instructors whose only job was to train. Japanese naval pilots, magnificent professionals at the outbreak of the war, still relied on a more artisanal system that produced small numbers of elite flyers. It had been adequate when Japan sought to win quickly. It was dangerously insufficient now that the struggle had become prolonged. None of this changed the immediate tasks before the combined fleet. Orders still needed to be written, convoys still had to be protected, air groups still had to be ferried to forward bases like Rabaul and Bougainville. Yet, in quiet conversations, far from the formal minutes of briefings, officers of Yamamoto's generation allowed themselves more candid assessments. "We are gambling damaged decks against a printing press," one of them remarked bitterly after a long night in the operations room. "Each time we send out carriers, we risk years of work. The Americans risk months." From the American side, the calculus looked almost inverted. Losses at Coral Sea and Midway had been heavy, and the prospect of facing the veteran Japanese fleet air arm in early engagements was terrifying. Yet, as 1942 turned into 1943, Washington could look at its building slips and pilot rosters and make plans that would have seemed fantastical only 2 years earlier. The 8 carriers that so disturbed Japanese calculations were, in American internal memoranda, only the first of a planned series that would populate multiple task forces. Staff officers in the newly formed Pacific Fleet headquarters in Pearl Harbor began sketching operations that assumed the routine availability of large concentrations of decks, raids into the Central Pacific, successive amphibious assaults along an island chain, simultaneous pressure in the Solomons and the Gilberts. This divergence in perspective. Japan, seeing each carrier battle as a roll of the dice, America steadily treating carriers as repeatable instruments within a larger pattern, lay at the heart of the psychological shift Yamamoto was grappling with. In his youth, naval strategy had been taught as a contest of singular events. In his maturity, he was watching it dissolve into a sequence of industrially supported operations where no single battle, however dramatic, could reverse the underlying arithmetic. From Tokyo's vantage point, the 8 new American carriers seemed to have appeared all at once, a bewildering eruption of steel. In fact, they were the visible crest of a wave that had begun the moment American shipyards shifted to war footing. Contract signatures in Washington, requisitions of steel and copper, retraining of welders and fitters, all those unseen decisions translated, after a lag of months and years, into launchings and commissionings. Japanese admirals who had never set foot in an American plant were now being forced to reckon with the consequences of that machinery. Yamamoto, who had walked the assembly lines in Detroit and ridden overnight trains through the American Midwest, found that the grim amazement he felt was tempered by a certain recognition. This was the logical endpoint of the processes he had studied as a young officer. It had only been a question of whether the United States would ever decide to turn all of that capacity toward war. That decision had now been made. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. At Combined Fleet Headquarters, the planning maps began to acquire a new, uncomfortable layer of annotation. Next to traditional symbols denoting Japanese carriers and battleships, staff officers penciled in estimates of American decks known to be in theater and those that intelligence believed were en route. Over time, these estimates grew less tentative. Reports from submarine skippers, reconnaissance flights, and signal intercepts corroborated one another. A carrier sighted at Noumea with a particular hull number later appeared in photographs taken near the Gilberts. Messages from American admirals, painstakingly decrypted, revealed task force designations centered on combinations of Essex-class and older carriers, with light carriers and escorts named in supporting roles. What emerged from this mosaic was not a picture of haphazard American improvisation, but of a systematic doctrine in formation. Fast carriers would serve as the striking arm, grouped into task forces that could be combined under a single fleet command. Escort carriers would handle convoy protection, anti-submarine patrols, and close air support for smaller landings. Land-based airfields, seizing footholds along the island chains, would extend the range of both. For Japanese planners raised on the idea that quality could offset quantity, this was a sobering revelation. There was no obvious weak seam to exploit, no single shipyard that, if destroyed, would paralyze American output. The network was too distributed, the industrial base too broad. The 8 carriers on Yamamoto's sheet of paper had been built in multiple yards, drawing on materials from every corner of the American mainland. Within the Naval General Staff, one thread of discussion turned repeatedly to the possibility of striking the American industrial heart directly. Voices argued, on paper, if not in public, for long-range submarine operations off the West Coast, or even fantastical schemes involving carrier raids on the Panama Canal or heavy industry. In each case, the same practical limitations surfaced. Japan lacked sufficient submarines with the range and numbers to sustain such attacks. Its carriers could not be spared from more immediate theaters without inviting disaster closer to home. The result was a kind of strategic claustrophobia. Japan could see the sources of American strength, understood them better than most wartime opponents had ever understood one another, yet lacked both the tools and the time to disrupt them. Yamamoto, rereading the intelligence annex that compared shipbuilding capacity in tonnage terms, recognized an irony there that he did not share with many colleagues. In earlier centuries, naval supremacy had belonged to those states whose dockyards and foundries had matured ahead of their rivals. Britain, in the age of sail and early steam, Germany, briefly, in the dreadnought era. Now, in the middle of the 20th century, Japan was confronting a United States that had taken that pattern and amplified it to a scale no one had ever attempted. The 8 carriers were impressive not only for what they were, but for how little of America's potential they represented. From the American point of view, they were a down payment on a larger vision. In Washington, staff officers of the Joint Chiefs spoke increasingly of 2 ocean requirements. If the United States was to prosecute major campaigns in both the Atlantic and Pacific, it would need carrier strength sufficient to sustain continuous operations in each theater. The Essex-class program, with its long series of hulls, had been designed with that in mind from the outset. Even as the first few ships entered service, later sisters were being modified based on combat lessons, their island superstructures refined, their radar and anti-aircraft outfits improved. To the Japanese, the speed of this feedback loop was startling. Lessons learned off Guadalcanal were appearing in the configuration of carriers commissioning a year later. Changes in American aircraft types, newer variants of carrier fighters and dive bombers, followed a similar rhythm. Behind each adjustment lay an industry capable of retooling on the fly, a research establishment feeding ideas into factories without paralysis. Yamamoto's private reflections in those months moved in 2 intertwined directions. Professionally, he pushed for what he had always advocated, concentration of force where it might still achieve local advantage. If Japan could not match the Americans hull for hull, perhaps it could still inflict disproportionate losses by choosing the place and time of battle carefully. Personally, he wrestled with what it meant for a naval officer to wage war in an era when the decisive instruments of victory lay far beyond his direct control in mines and mills thousands of miles from any harbor. He was not the only one facing that realization. On the American side, admirals who had come up through the age of battleships found themselves commanding formations whose most important weapons took off from flight decks rather than rising from gun turrets. Their decisions still mattered deeply. How to deploy carriers, how close to risk them to shore-based air, how to coordinate with landings. But they were acutely aware that their daring rested on a foundation of replacement hulls and air groups assured by their government. As 1943 unfolded and operations pushed further across the Pacific, the consequences of the imbalance that had so troubled Yamamoto became painfully visible. When American carriers took losses, they could often withdraw to repair facilities with a reasonable expectation of returning to service. New hulls, meanwhile, arrived to fill the gaps. When Japanese carriers took equivalent damage, the consequences radiated through their entire planning cycle. Air groups were broken up. Scarce pilots were lost. Shipyard space had to be found amidst competing needs. Each torpedo or bomb that struck a Japanese deck was, in effect, striking at years of future options. It was in that pattern, not only in the tally of ships at any one moment, but in the differing ability to absorb and recover from attrition, that Yamamoto's remark about the sleeping giant found its fullest meaning. America was not merely awake. It was learning to fight in a way that turned its industrial strengths into a continual pressure at sea. From his desk in Tokyo or Truk, the Admiral could do little to alter that reality. He could only, with increasing frankness in his written and spoken words, insist that his own leaders understand the kind of war they were now in. In one conference, after yet another presentation that treated carriers as if they were timeless assets rather than perishable ones, he reportedly said, "We speak of these ships as though they were mountains. They are, in truth, like waves. The Americans have learned how to send one after another. We, at best, can raise a few and hope that one of them breaks where it will do the most good." The 8 carriers on his intelligence sheet were only the early waves. The sea behind them was still rising. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today.